Let's look at some of the different suspension features seen on vehicles today. The suspension of a vehicle may be either a solid axle design or one with independent suspension. On a vehicle with a solid axle suspension, both wheels are mounted on a solid axle. This is also known as dependent suspension. This means what happens on one side of the vehicle affects the opposite side. In an independent suspension, each wheel is individually attached to the frame. If one wheel encounters a bump, only that side of the suspension is affected. The opposite side remains flat and in better contact with the road surface.
For many years, the typical suspension in a front-engine, rear-wheel drive application was independent front suspension and dependent rear suspension.
Because on dependent rear suspension, the rear wheels are driven through axle shafts located inside the axle housing, this is known as a live axle. A live rear axle is a housing that contains the drive axles and differential. It also serves as the lower attachment point for the vehicle's suspension. In its simplest form, the axle assembly is attached to the frame or body by leaf springs mounted parallel to the frame rails. This is called a Hotchkiss design.
Suspension systems make extensive use of control arms. These control arms allow for up and down movement of the axle and wheel assembly. A rod called a panhard rod or track bar is attached to the frame on one side of the axle and to the axle itself on the other. This allows the suspension arms to control braking and acceleration torque, while the rod controls side-to-side movement.
Now let's take a closer look at how coil springs are used in the front suspension. A common type of front suspension is called the long-arm, short-arm suspension. In this system, two A-shaped arms, sometimes called A-frames, are attached to the frame through rubber bushings. These are called upper and lower control arms. A component called the steering knuckle is located between the two control arms and is attached to the arms by upper and lower ball joints. The front wheel hub and bearings are supported by the spindle. The ball joints allow the spindle and wheel assembly to pivot and turn left and right, while the entire assembly is free to move up and down. The spring is usually placed between the lower control arm and the frame. In this arrangement, the weight of the vehicle rests on the lower control arm.
In some suspension systems, the shock absorber and spring are combined into one unit called a McPherson strut. This component consists of a shock absorber unit, a coil spring, an upper pivot, and a lower clamp. The upper pivot mounts to the fender well. The rest of the unit rotates when the steering is used. The lower clamp secures the spindle assembly and strut together into a single unit. The advantages of a McPherson strut are lightweight, compact design, and simple operation. Since no upper control arm is needed, more space is available inside the engine compartment.